In a climate-controlled vault inside the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, a strip of darkened animal skin lies flat under glass, kept at a fixed temperature and a fixed humidity, sealed away from air. It was pulled from a cave above the Dead Sea in 1947 by a shepherd throwing stones. For 40 years after that, almost no one was allowed to read it. The books it belongs to were removed from the Bible, cut from the canon, left out of the Old Testament, dismissed by the councils that fixed scripture in the 4th century, called dangerous, called heretical, quietly buried by the tradition that came after. For nearly 2,000 years, most of what was written at Qumran simply was not in anyone's Bible. Then in 1947, the caves opened. Around 800 manuscripts surfaced above the Dead Sea. Among them, more copies of the Book of Enoch than of most books that made it into the Old Testament. More copies of the Book of Jubilees than of every canonical book except 4. Texts the Church had spent 17 centuries erasing were sitting in clay, older than any complete Bible on earth, older than any surviving New Testament manuscript. And what those banned books describe is not doctrine. It is not theology. The scrolls describe a war planned in advance down to the trumpet signals and the troop rotations. They describe watchers imprisoned in the earth. They name the beings. They describe the seal. They record who is held and why they cannot be released. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a field record. In the next several minutes, you will see what the scrolls actually say, how closely it tracks what excavators later pulled out of the same ground, and why access to these fragments was locked to a handful of men and denied to everyone else until 1991. If forbidden biblical history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The scrolls were not one book. They were a library, and the library was sorted. The manuscripts came out of 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran, and the richest of them, Cave 4, held tens of thousands of fragments from more than 500 separate works. Copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible sat beside books the Bible left out entirely. The most heavily copied works in the entire collection were not the ones that survived into Scripture. They were the ones that were cut. Take the manuscript count, because the numbers do not behave the way tradition says they should. Fragments of the Book of Jubilees appear in as many as 15 copies at Qumran. Fragments of Enoch in roughly a dozen. By raw manuscript count, Jubilees is better attested at Qumran than every book of the Old Testament except Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Genesis. The community that buried these scrolls copied the banned books more often than they copied most of the Bible. A text does not get copied 12 times by people who think it is worthless. It gets copied 12 times by people who think it is true. And this is where it gets disturbing, because the content of those most copied banned books does not read like Scripture. It reads like documentation. What we're looking at breaks into 3 parts. Start with the strangest single object in the entire collection, the one they called the War Scroll. The War Scroll, cataloged as 1QM, was found in Cave 1, one of the first 7 scrolls recovered. It describes a final war between 2 sides. It names the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. On the surface, that reads like the vague cosmic conflict of apocalyptic writing. Light against dark. Good against evil. The problem is the level of detail. The scroll does not speak in symbols. It gives you the order of battle. It specifies the dimensions of the shields. It gives the length of the spears in cubits, and the length of the swords, and the width of the blades. It names the metals the trumpets are made from, and assigns each trumpet a separate signal. One call to assemble, another to advance, another to pursue, another to withdraw. It dictates the exact words to be engraved on each banner as the army moves, different inscriptions for the advance, for the engagement, for the return. It positions the cavalry, counts the ranks, and sets the ages of the men permitted to fight. No ancient apocalypse writes like this: Apocalypse deals in beasts and horns, and numbers that stand for kingdoms. This deals in cubits and inventory. And then it does the thing that should not be there at all. It sets a schedule. The war is laid out across 40 years, divided into stages, with specific years assigned to specific campaigns, and rest years written in between when the lines pull back and regroup. He was not writing a vision of good triumphing over evil. He was writing a battle plan, with logistics, with a timetable, with a materials list. Whoever wrote it treated a war that had not yet happened as an operation to be scheduled. He wasn't interpreting signs. He was documenting an order of battle. But the text doesn't stop there. What follows in the collection is stranger still. Alongside the war scroll sit the copies of Enoch, and the Enoch material found at Qumran is written in Aramaic, older than the Ethiopic version most people know. Fragment 4, Q201. One of the oldest Enoch manuscripts on Earth carries the story of the Watchers, angels who came down, took human wives, and taught humanity things it was not meant to know. The surface reading is a moral fable about forbidden knowledge, but the Aramaic fragments do not moralize. They list, they name the individual Watchers, they record exactly what each one taught: metalworking and weapons, the cutting of roots, sorcery, the signs of the sun and the moon and the stars. It reads like a personnel file, a record of who did what. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible. The Enoch material describes the punishment of these beings in physical, located terms. They are bound and cast into a specific opening in the earth, sealed under sharp and jagged rocks, in a place of fire and darkness, to be held until the day of judgment. The text does not say they were destroyed. It says they were contained, bound, sealed, filed away in a location, with a duration, awaiting a hearing. He describes the door. He names what is inside. He records why it cannot be opened. This is not the language of myth. This is the language of a warden logging a prisoner. Here's what the translators left out. For decades, the only versions of Enoch most readers could access came through the Ethiopic manuscripts, filtered through the standard English editions. In those editions, the punishment of the Watchers gets rendered in soft, abstract phrasing: a place of confusion, a prison of the fallen. But the Aramaic fragments recovered from Cave 4, the oldest witnesses to the text, use harder, more concrete language. The Aramaic term behind the standard word prison does not carry the sense of a jail cell. It carries the sense of a sealed pit, an opening in the ground closed from above. Not a punishment in the abstract, a location that was shut. The older the manuscript, the more physical the description becomes. The text moves on, but the implication sits there. The further back you go toward the original, the less it sounds like a metaphor and the more it sounds like a place. What modern readers don't realize is how closely this matches what excavation actually found at Qumran. For years, the popular assumption was that the scrolls were the private library of a small desert sect, and nothing more. Ideas with no anchor in the ground. But the ruins beside the caves complicate that. Excavations at Qumran uncovered an elaborate system of aqueducts and stepped cisterns cut into the rock, a settlement engineered around water and ritual purity, occupied and rebuilt across generations. In 1996 and after, ground surveys and renewed digs traced a network far more deliberate than a hermit's camp. Whoever produced these scrolls was organized, methodical, and building for permanence. The people who wrote about a war scheduled to the year and a prison sealed until judgment were the same people who cut precision channels into limestone and planned their settlement like an installation. The parallel is not metaphorical. It is structural. The scrolls describe planning, sealing, and containment. The ground they came out of shows planning, sealing, and containment. The mind that wrote the documents and the hands that built the site match. There is a second confirmation, and it comes from the material itself. When the scrolls were dated, The results lined up in a way the dismissers did not expect. Radiocarbon testing on the parchment, run in the 1990s on samples from multiple manuscripts, returned dates clustering across the last 2 centuries before the Common Era and into the first. Paleographers, reading the handwriting styles independently, arrived at the same window. 2 separate methods, the physics of carbon decay and the evolution of script, agreed. These were not medieval forgeries or late inventions. The banned books, the War Scroll, the Enoch fragments, the Watcher lists were copied by real hands on real skin during the exact period the texts claim to describe. Older than the Gospels, older than any complete Bible, written when the events they treat as scheduled were, to their authors, still ahead. The suppression starts with the councils that fixed the canon in the 4th century, the same period that saw Enoch and Jubilees pushed out of Western scripture over a single unacceptable idea: that angels could descend and breed with women. The books that said so were cut. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400, treated such writings as apocryphal, outside the true canon, not to be trusted. Augustine, writing in the same era, argued that books like Enoch were too old and too uncertain to be believed, and that the church was right to leave them out. Neither man addressed the specifics. Neither explained why the excluded books were the ones the oldest communities had copied most. Only the Ethiopian church kept Enoch whole, in Ge'ez, outside the reach of Rome, and the West did not see a full copy until the Scottish explorer James Bruce carried manuscripts out of Ethiopia in 1773. When European scholars finally read them, the reaction was not curiosity, it was dismissal. The Watcher passages were treated as primitive, as garbled folklore, as an embarrassment best explained away. The pattern held for a century. The most concrete claims got the most confident dismissals, always without an answer to how the text knew what it knew. Then the caves opened in 1947, and the suppression stopped being about theology and became about access. This is the part most people never hear. The scrolls from Cave 4, the tens of thousands of fragments that held the banned books, were handed to a small, closed team of scholars in the early 1950s. That team was given exclusive rights. No one outside it could see the unpublished fragments, and they published slowly. Decade after decade, the bulk of Cave 4 stayed unpublished. By the late 1980s, nearly 40 years after discovery, a large share of the material had still never been released to the public or to other scholars. Researchers who asked to see it were refused. A generation of experts died without ever reading fragments that had been out of the ground since before they were born. Now, here's where it gets active. In 1991, the wall broke, and it broke against the will of the people guarding it. That September, 2 scholars in Cincinnati reconstructed suppressed texts using a privately circulated concordance, a limited index of about 30 copies, and published them. Days later, a research library in California quietly revealed that a complete backup set of scroll photographs made decades earlier in case of war and stored in a vault had been sitting in its collection unlisted. The library announced it would open the photographs to anyone. The official response was not relief. It was a threatened lawsuit. The authorities that had held the monopoly accused the library of acting improperly and moved to stop the release. It did not work. The 40-year lock was broken not by the guardians, but around them by an anonymous set of negatives that were never supposed to exist. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying the Dead Sea Scrolls are a literal operations manual for the end of the world, that a real war is scheduled, or a real pit of bound angels is waiting under a specific rock. The scrolls are ancient religious texts, and much of what they contain is prayer, law, and commentary. But what the most copied banned books describe, when you read them in the oldest form, does not behave like myth. A war planned to the cubit and the year, a class of beings named, cataloged, and sealed in a located pit until a hearing. a community that built its home with the same precision it used to write its documents. And a set of fragments so sensitive that the men who controlled them refused to let anyone else read them for 40 years. He had no reason to invent logistics for a war that never came. And yet the scroll sits there, in Hebrew and Aramaic, in ink on skin older than the Gospels, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the banned books were the most heavily copied works in the entire library, if the people who copied them built a sealed, engineered settlement to house them, if the texts describe planning and containment in concrete, located, physical language rather than symbol, and if the fragments were guarded so tightly for so long that access had to be forced open against a lawsuit, then the scrolls are not a curiosity the canon safely discarded. They are a record someone worked very hard to keep closed. Whoever wrote them was not dreaming. He was documenting with the flat, methodical tone you would use filing a report you expected someone to act on. What the scrolls describe is either a set of symbols the tradition was right to set aside, or it is exactly what it appears to be, an account too specific and too dangerous to leave in anyone's Bible. The fragments are still there. The strip of skin still lies flat under glass in Jerusalem, temperature fixed, air sealed out. The tens of thousands of cave 4 pieces are still cataloged in their trays, the banned books outnumbering the canon around them. The ruins at Qumran still hold their cut channels and sealed cisterns in the cliff face above the water. The photographs that broke the monopoly still sit in a library vault in California. The negatives, no one was supposed to find. And in books the church removed from scripture 17 centuries ago, an army is still waiting for its trumpet, and a pit is still sealed until the judgment exactly the way the scrolls said they would be. The seal is still intact. The record is still there. And most of what was written above the Dead Sea is still telling us something the people who buried it did not intend for us to read. If this is the kind of history that pulls you in, the investigation continuing on screen now goes deeper into what the banned books were never supposed to reveal.